welcome a fellow Penn Stater, Mr. Dane Miller.
Thank you. Is my mic, is this on? Yes, that is on. Okay, so you guys are here for a sports-specific endurance training talk, so I wanted to ask the first most important question: who did their cardio this morning? And doing sets of 5 back squats does not count for power lifters and for weightlifters out there. I just thought that'd be a funny joke to start off with. Now, I do not have any conflict of interest in here, so what I wanted to start off with was share a little bit about my own story around endurance-based training and thinking through the lens or the filter of almost having an ignorance around endurance-based training. And an ignorance based around the fact that growing up, I didn't like to do endurance-based training. I had asthma, I struggled to do it, I struggled to deal with the mental stress around endurance-based training, and I also had quite a bit of success personally just by getting stronger, getting more explosive, and training in that realm. And then as I sort of started Garage Strength in training athletes, I continued to have this sort of ignorance towards the aspect of endurance-based training, mainly because of the fact that I still didn't like to do endurance-based training. I still noticed that most athletes at a younger age don't really need to be doing a ton of endurance-based work, at least in my opinion, because they can reap the rewards of just lifting weights, doing resistance-based training, squatting more, cleaning more, deadlifting more, whatever it is that you like to do. I think that tends to be where most younger athletes can have a benefit. But that ignorance sort of stunted me in how to make progress. And I would even say, too, to a point, if you're a collegiate coach or you do own a private setting, one of the other hard things around endurance-based training is if you want to focus on certain aspects of endurance-based training, it's hard to have somebody come into your gym, pay a $20 drop-in fee, and then tell them to sit on the assault bike for 90 minutes and do, long, slow distance work. So I think that was some of the big factors into my ignorance, but fortunately, at least I believe fortunately, I've gotten out of that mindset. And I wanted to go into some of the big things early on for me personally was the fact that I would read, research in endurance-based training, and I would read from Steven Seiler or Alex Hutchinson or Inigo San Milan, these like top-notch endurance-based researchers, and I would think about what I was reading, and the problem that I had also as a coach was I had my system of strength, my system of explosive work, my system of strength work, and I didn't know how to apply that aspect that I was learning into a full-blown system without disrupting what I had already created. And I think that that's a similar concept that a lot of us might struggle with as strength coaches, is that we don't really know how to program it or when to program it or how to lay things out. And it's also hard to read and to do this research and to study, and then also still have time to try and improve your craft. So I think I wanted to touch on that aspect, and it sort of set things up where as a group or as a community of strength coaches, I feel like we have a pretty good understanding of what endurance is, but we don't know how to specifically set up different sports, okay, and setting up those different sports with different types of endurance-based work. And so my goal for today is that you guys are going to leave here today with a system to actually implement endurance training into specific sports. So you could leave today and try to build out a specific workout calendar. Okay, you're going to get volume ratios of what endurance-based training, like percentages of endurance-based training relative to the other areas of strength and conditioning. And personally, I believe that there's only 4 areas of strength and conditioning, okay, that we actually need to focus on. It's going to be explosive work, it's going to be strength work, it's going to be speed work, and it's going to be endurance. That's literally all we need to think about is those 4 realms, okay? And so that's what we're going to really get into today. And then you're going to also learn how to evaluate an athlete and then get into some workout and layout examples. So some of these questions I think too that we need to think through is, should a shot putter train like an endurance, should a shot putter run for a greater endurance? Should a marathoner squat more? Should soccer players focus on long, constant runs? I think these are some consistent questions that I personally had when I was starting to really figure out how I could train our athletes that need more endurance a little bit more effectively. And so I do want to get into a little bit of who I am personally, because that will come out a little bit in this presentation, is that I was a shot putter at Penn State, which is one reason why I hated doing any endurance-based work. My freshman year, we would run a 5K every Friday, and I would usually throw up every single Friday, so I hated running. I trained under Dr. Anatoly Bondarchuk. Does anybody know who Dr. Anatoly Bondarchuk is? Some of you, okay. Jacob knows, great. I started a private gym in a 400 square foot facility in my parents' garage. I grew that into an elite sports performance training center where we train world-class athletes. I do have a YouTube channel, Garage Strength. Please like, subscribe, ring that notification bell, and also download my strength training app, Peak Strength. I'm also the strength coach for South Dakota State's wrestling team, and I am the head coach for Team Samoa. For Americans, it's Samoa, but for Samoans, it's Samoa. And I will be going to Paris in the next 2 weeks to go to the Olympics for my second time. So some of the sports that I've coached at the world stage have been sports like freestyle wrestling, okay? And that was really where I first started to dive deeper into endurance-based work, is working with two-time NCAA champion Nick Wazowski, who was also a two-time world bronze medalist. I had to at least learn a little bit of endurance components for that. Training Haley Reichert, who was she was an Olympic weightlifter who got a world bronze medalist. I've trained athletes in the NFL. I've trained athletes in track and field, where we have 5 athletes going to Paris this year, all in track and field. I've trained athletes on the world level in swimming, representing the United States, athletes in sprint cycling representing Canada, and athletes in snowboarding and canoeing as well. So all of these different sports have enabled me to sort of play around with these ratios and play around with thought processes and try to make it as easy as possible for us to apply endurance into their program. So some endurance misconceptions, and I think that this is where I really had to unlearn some key concepts for myself. Especially with the fact that I did not like doing endurance-based training growing up. I needed to learn through or work through some of these false beliefs that I had. And I did not mention this earlier, but I did go to college. My college degree is in religious studies. And I don't know if I even told Doug that, but I got my college degree in religious studies, and you will see that Confucius is my favorite philosopher. And so one of the things behind this is that the man who asks a question is a fool for a minute. The man who does not ask is a fool for life. And I think that sort of struck home with me in regards to endurance-based training. And I hope it also goes home with you guys today, that you ask me as many questions as possible later on, so that we don't go being a fool for life. So the first thing I had to unlearn, which I also did want to say, I don't really like the color of this font. I did not have that font in my original presentation, just for you guys to be aware. My one big false belief early on was that only weak athletes need endurance. Okay, so I had that in my head, that athletes that need endurance are weak, meaning they don't back squat a lot, they don't bench press a lot, they don't clean heavy, they're just weak, right? They're pathetic. But in fact, obviously that's not the case. Okay, here's Gwiz. This was actually after Gwiz beat Gable Stevenson, who was the Olympic champ from 21. He beat him in 19 to make the world team. And Nick clearly needed a lot of endurance to win 2 world bronze medals, okay? You need a lot of endurance in specific sports, so I had to unlearn the fact that not everybody who uses endurance training doesn't mean that they're all weak, okay? Endurance this is another one. Endurance makes you weak, okay? So this is actually a meme, and I said this earlier to one of my buddies. This meme, to me, I think this was on T Nation in like 2004, before memes were actually coined memes. But you see here, this dude on the side, this is Dwayne Chambers. He was a 100-meter sprinter from Great Britain who actually got popped. But he has a great physique, a phenomenal physique. Everybody wants to train like him, right? We want to train, what do you want? You want to train like a sprinter? Or you want to train like this dude who's more bald than I am and clearly frail. Okay, and I think that contrasting image is what we were taught in the realm of strength and conditioning, that like endurance makes you weak. Now, I don't think that is true or can be held true even today. And I will call this slide here, the CrossFit doesn't suck as bad as we originally thought it does slide, because we have seen from CrossFit that you can get really strong and have a lot of improvement in your endurance. And I like to use this picture of Matt Frazier here because he continuously made progress throughout his career, throughout being one of the best CrossFitters of all time with his back squat, with his cleans, with his snatches, and he even grew up as a weightlifter. He was a competitive weightlifter that was at the OTC, but every single morning when he was in his CrossFit career, he was focusing on improving his aerobic capacity by doing specific things on the rower every single morning for long periods of time, while still increasing his strength. And this next false belief, okay, is a big one that I also think is sort of hammered home because of CrossFit. A lot of people, a lot of coaches will say, and I do want to touch on this, the fact that a lot of these false beliefs were literally taught to me by like some of the best strength coaches in the world. Some of the absolute best strength coaches in the world said you can't get strong and improve your endurance at the same time. Okay, so I want to just say that it's pretty common that people think that way. And this number 4, athletes can't do technical things for endurance-based training. And I think this stems from seeing CrossFitters cycling barbells and doing cleans for like sets of 21, right? What's the one, like 21, 15, 9 or whatever is a consistent theme. And I'm not saying that we should be doing cleans and snatches for 21 reps, but there are ways that we can get creative and use technical things for endurance training. And the reason why I have, this is Tanner Sloan, so he's one of the best wrestlers that I've ever coached. He's a NCAA finalist. He also got 5th this past year. He's a 2-time NCAA All-American from South Dakota State. And we deploy technical endurance training in South Dakota State system, which we will share later on. So there are ways that you can do this. So endurance negatively impacts recovery. And this was something that I felt growing up that was a huge one for me, was that every time I would do some type of cardio or go for a run with the high school football coaches, if we were doing, we would do like 9 laps around the track, then 9 stadiums, something like that, right? We call them triple 9s, I think. I would feel dead the next day, okay? So in my mind, endurance had a negative impact on recovery. That might be true to a point, but there's a lot of unique ways that we can avoid that. And I have a picture here of Sam Mattis. Sam just got 2nd at the Olympic trials 2 weeks ago, so he is one of our athletes that is going to represent the United States in Paris. And Sam regularly does some forms of easier endurance-based work. We use 3 different methods with him specifically, and that helps him, 1, take more throws at a higher intensity, and 2, he's able to even take throws, this past year during qualifying and on the day of the final, we threw in the morning, then he went home, took a nap, and then we threw in the afternoon in the final, and he threw really well, and that enabled him to get out of the house and to get his body moving and prepared for the upcoming competition. Another one, running and puking aren't the only ways to get more endurance, and that was something that I had sort of just ironed into my brain, because we've all had that high school coach that it's like you're going to run till you throw up, and running or cardio or endurance work is used basically as punishment, which is why you hate doing it, or you would just throw up from it. And I wanted to put up this picture here of Daniel Stahl. So he is a 335-pound discus thrower. He's an Olympic champion, multiple-time world champion. And Daniel every single morning walks for over 60 minutes, okay? Now, just remember, this is sport-specific endurance. For a discus thrower, going for a 60-minute walk is endurance, okay? So that's okay. And one thing that Daniel will tell you is that if he isn't sweating and if he doesn't go for that walk, he typically gains a little bit of weight, and he also can't take as many throws in his sessions later on in the session. So that walk on a daily basis is a type of endurance for him, which enables him to take higher intensity throws. Okay, and then this is a big one, and I sort of touched on this. Actually, the bottom sort of cuts this off. So endurance doesn't do anything for the mind. And I have this here mainly, one, I also love this quote over here from Confucius, is that silence is a true friend who never betrays. And I think that that's the biggest thing I've learned in my journey of endurance myself, is that there's a point when you're doing endurance-based work for long periods of time that you just have to cut off your brain and just let your body execute a rhythmic flow. And I think that that's where those lessons around endurance-based training can really transfer very well to every single sport. And I'm going to get into some of that that flow aspect, even when we're talking about some ways that we use Olympic weightlifting as well. So those are the 7 key false beliefs that I think I had to smash. And I just wanted to throw in here, I had to personally smash this so that I could go from being a shot putter myself, weighing 300 pounds, to getting to the point where I did run 2 marathons. I have run 2 marathons, and it's hard to make that transition. I think as strength coaches, if we have a better understanding of endurance knowledge and we have a better understanding of how to implement endurance knowledge, we're not just going to improve our athletes and who they are, we're also going to improve them for their performances and for their goals. And we need to go back to those 4 key aspects. If we can understand how endurance fits into the equation, that also involves strength, that also involves speed, and that also involves explosiveness, that's going to help us fit onto this spectrum. And right now I feel like there's a spectrum of you can get all your endurance just from playing the sport over here, and then you have the you should run and puke as a coach over here, and we're somewhere here in the middle. Look who just walked in the door. Oh, the legend. I have that same jacket. That's one of the greatest weightlifting coaches to ever exist. Okay, so what is endurance? We're going to talk here, what is endurance? Endurance, by definition, and if you guys want a resource that I think you should read, there's a book called Indoor. Okay, so this book, Indoor, is from Alex Hutch, a bunch of different aspects around endurance-based training. But when we think about what it means, okay, to remain firm under suffering or misfortune without yielding, okay, withstand hardship or adversity, you've got to be freaking tough to have some type of endurance, okay? And I think that if we can think through that and even think about that with different sports and what the different sport tests are when we're competing, that's going to help as a coach as well. And so I want to get into, now we're going to get into some of the physiology behind endurance-based work. I want to keep this part as simple as possible. 1, because I'm not a physiologist, and 2, I just think it's going to be more fun to get into some of the actual applied stuff. So we'll get through this, and then we're going to go into some evaluation before we really get into some of the applied stuff where I want to take a lot of questions. So I personally look at endurance through 3 lenses, okay? So with my brain, I really like to keep things simple. So again, I have those 4 key aspects: strength, endurance, explosiveness, and speed, okay? So off of the endurance tree, I look at it and I go, okay, there's sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. This is going to be training that we do inside of the weight room that is going to improve strength endurance. We will do a lot of isolation movements. We will do a lot of exercises chasing the pump. We will do a lot of bodybuilding movements, and it's not bad. It will improve endurance, and it will improve strength endurance. It will improve multiple different aspects of performance. Somebody like Sam, you know, if he has an issue with his pec from throwing discus so frequently, I will, and you know, by like throw 20, throw 22, throw 24 in training, he's fatiguing. We will try to localize that area, that problem area, with some type of sarcoplasmic work, like super high reps, bring that in and try to improve that area. 2 of the other big areas that I look at. So I think about sarcoplasmic hypertrophy as one aspect of endurance. The second aspect, this is going to be entirely based around increasing blood volume or increasing mitochondria, specifically in type 1 muscle fibers. And I think another area of ignorance for me that I held was, I learned that mitochondria exist inside type 1 muscle fibers, a slow twitch muscle fibers. And as soon as I heard the word slow twitch, I was like, I can't do this training if we're talking about slow twitch work. And I think there's a couple examples that will show that it's okay that strength and power athletes do some slow twitch work. It's actually okay. They're going to be all right. And that's where increasing blood volume, increasing mitochondrial volume is important. Okay, and then increasing cardiac output. Increasing blood volume too, we're going to see things like capillarization happen, more capillarization. We're going to see left ventricle hypertrophy occur, and that's going to play a pretty important role in development of transporting oxygen. And increased cardiac output. This is going to be what I think about as like a vertical jump or the broad jump of how your heart operates. Okay, if we can get our heart to pump harder, to be more explosive, as weird as that sounds, it can pump more blood each time. Okay, so that's going to help with increasing our VO2 max and getting more blood throughout the body. So that's going to take us into, I wanted to share like just 3 simple studies here. If you have any interest in writing these down, reading these. This study on the left here, this is a study, this was from, or sort of like an abstract or a review from Brad Schoenfeld, where he just talks about the muscle pump, chasing the pump, and what are the physiological factors of chasing the pump? What does that mean? We do indeed see a higher level of muscle protein synthesis. There's another researcher, Roberts et al., just had a paper come out in 21 where sarcoplasmic hypertrophy actually might be expanding muscular cells so that more myofibrils can enter into the muscular cells to increase strength. But it does lead to greater muscle protein synthesis. And I think that when we look at endurance and what that definition of endurance means for a sport that is more strength and power focused, this is going to be an important adaptation that we want. Okay, when I'm looking at something like wrestling or training an 800-meter runner or training a marathoner, I'm going to look at these 2 papers over here, and especially the top right, high-intensity interval training increases cardiac output and VO2 max. VO2 max being how well can your body utilize oxygen. And I think these papers are very, very good at just explaining what we need to do as strength coaches and how we can apply that. And later on, we're going to have a week layout that you can see where we can put specifics into there. So adaptations to endurance and strength training, that's a paper where I have this graphic came out of, okay? So if we see mitochondrial respiration or mitochondrial content, if we think about ATP, mitochondria create ATP so that our body can actually execute tasks, like me standing here right now. If we want to develop a greater density of a greater amount of mitochondria, we can do things like long, slow distance. And there's even been, Inigo San Milan has had papers that he's come out where mitochondrial content in a long distance cyclist, an endurance cyclist, they will have 3 to 4 times the amount of mitochondria compared to an athlete that is sort of like a normal level athlete. So we need to focus on what that does and how that helps us increase our pace in certain sports. Mitochondrial respiration is going to be how quickly can the mitochondria replenish ATP and also handle lactate. Okay, and this is going to take us, that lactate little transfer is going to take us into a very brief discussion on energy systems, because I still think some of this stuff is a little tough to comprehend. I want to start off right away with the blue line being the alactic energy system. So thinking about doing something for 5 to 15 seconds, like taking a discus throw. Okay, that's where we're going to be using stored ATP. If we're doing, and now I'm going to switch to the green line. The green line would be working on something aerobic, and I want to compare this with the red line, which would be using glycolysis, using the glycolytic system. And so when we're using the glycolytic system, if I'm running, let's say I'm on a 5-mile run and it's flat and I'm running at about 80 to 85% of my heart rate, I'm going to be using my aerobic system the entire time and I will not be getting fatigued. But if I start to run up a hill and I need more power output, my body will feel as I'm running up this hill that I need to produce more power if I want to maintain that pace. And then I will start to utilize more glucose to create ATP, and then that will be using the glycolytic system, and then it might slowly shut off if we start to get on a level ground. And so I think it's important to understand to a point where these energy systems flow and where they come into play, because it will come into how we're analyzing athletes and what those specific athletes will need when we're building out their actual training program. And so I'll look at this and I lay out, when I'm laying out a program, okay, so I think through, all right, I'm training using the 800-meter runner. I'm training an 800-meter runner. I want to look at what the ratio is of percentage of endurance work, strength work, speed work, explosive work, and then I look at their training program based off of what their sport coach might have, and then I can figure out piece by piece where all this stuff fits in based off of the work I've done on the front end. And that's how I sort of think through writing this program. And so if I'm thinking about, actually in the example of an 800-meter runner, I might look through that lens of, okay, what's their duration of max intensity? If you watch the Paris Diamond League this past week, there was 6 guys running a 141-800. That's really freaking fast, but it's basically developed on a very strong aerobic base. Now, if we have a shot putter, we're gonna be seeing most of their actions are gonna be done with using the alactic system. Recovery between bouts might be like what an offensive lineman would be dealing with, or a defensive lineman. That's gonna be the alactic system and the glycolytic system, but we still need to do some aerobic capacity work. Duration of constant activity, that's where we're gonna be focusing on trying to improve an athlete's pace while staying in the aerobic system. And this comes in, so this would be like a marathoner trying to increase or lower their time in a marathon. This plays a massive role even in a sport like wrestling. And then obviously then 2, total training volume, capacity, strength, speed, endurance, how much can they handle as an athlete, and there should be explosiveness on there. There's not, that's an error on the slide. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about that? Because I want to go into how we evaluate this, and I think most of the value that you guys are going to get out of this is going to be once we get through some of this stuff. I know this is like a little bit of a slog. Yeah.
For an athlete like shot putter, what method would you use to kind of dig into their aerobic work?
Like the
Would be salt play, would be
yeah, like easy cyclical work. So that's yeah, well, but mainly that would be a little bit too fatiguing. Sauna and cyclical work. So that's good. Okay, so we'll get into all that stuff but yeah, that's a good question. All right, so if we go into evaluating athletes' needs, okay, we have to think through, using that 800-meter example, I might beat that to a dead horse, is that I'm thinking through what are the adaptations needed for this 800-meter runner. They have to be really freaking fast, okay? They've got to run like 48 to 50 point in a 400-meter. That's very, very quickly. And then they have to do it again. That's very quick, okay? That's world class also. If we have a high school kid, they're not going to be that fast, but we need to focus on their speed. We need to focus on their endurance. We need to make sure that they're strong enough so that they don't break down, and they also have to be explosive, okay? So we need to look at how can we test these athletes. And I want to share a quick story here is that this was essentially the turning point for me as a coach, because this was the biggest failure I had as a coach, is this athlete here on top. His name's Pete Renda, okay? And you guys can fact check me on all of this. This is a true story. Pete was the first state champion in wrestling that I ever coached, he started training with me in 9th grade, and he was an absolute dog, okay? And he sort of fell in line with the same aspect that I had myself personally, was that he was extraordinarily strong. Okay, so 2 weeks before he won the PA state title, and if you're from Pennsylvania, or you know, if you're from Pennsylvania and you wrestle, it's like you're a god if you become a state champion. Okay, we are very clearly the best state for wrestling, which is why Penn State destroys everybody in wrestling every single year, and that makes me really proud. But let's go back to Pete's story. Okay, so with Pete, he graduates, he goes to college. I'm working with Gwiz. Gwiz went to NC State. Pete goes to NC State. He wins the ACC. Junior year, he gets 3rd at NCAAs, okay? Huge accomplishment, okay? 3rd at 184, where all the savages are. He loses in the semifinals against Gabe Dean, who ended up winning the national title that year, okay? He lost like 6-3. So pretty tough match, but 3rd period, he gassed out. Comes back, wrestles back to 3rd, okay? He comes back his senior year. So this would have been, I want to say, 18. Okay, so Pete's senior year, he goes through the whole year, and he always had this problem of not having the best endurance. So I didn't share. I didn't share his numbers in high school. When he was in high school, he snatched 98 kilos 2 weeks before his state championship. Okay, so that's close to a 220, and he was a 170-pounder in high school. He could do a rope climb, and we have a video on my YouTube channel from like 2013, 14, of Pete doing a rope climb on a 2-inch rope with an 80-pound kettlebell without using his feet. He single leg squatted, and this was before we created the Garage Strength single leg roller that's available at garagestrength.com. He single leg squatted on a box, 315 for reps, okay? Comes with the pad too. And the other thing that Pete did was he benched 350 and he could back squat 450, and that's ass to grass, back squat. So he was a total freak of nature, okay? But he always had that cardio problem. And I knew he had the cardio problem, but he could hide it because he could just toy with kids because he was so strong. Now we get to his senior year. He goes the entire year ranked #1 in the country, the entire year, okay? So mops everybody up, gets to the NCAA tournament. I think he had like 1 loss that year before the tournament. And because of the way the NCAA ranks people, he got a crappy draw. He got ranked 2nd because they love the Big Ten, which is fine because Penn State's in the Big Ten. And they put Pete he was ranked #2. So Pete's ranked #2. And the kid that he has to wrestle, his name's Dominic Abinader. Again, look all this up. I think Abinader might even represent Lebanon. So he wrestles Abinader, okay, in the quarterfinals. And the tournament, the NCAA tournament is ungodly hard. Pete goes out, wrestles this kid, loses in 4 overtimes. Terrible, just horrible, right? Has to come back in 45 minutes because he's in the quarters. So if you win in the quarters, you become an All-American. If you lose, you've got to win two more matches to even be an All-American. So Pete loses, has to wrestle this kid from Nebraska who had gotten upset in the opening round, in the preliminaries. He has to wrestle this kid, and Pete only beat this kid 7-5 earlier in the year. Has to wrestle him 45 minutes later, and he loses. Done. So this lesson is if we knew how to evaluate, and I'm tying this into the speech because if I knew at the time how to evaluate Pete and how to look at what Pete's problem was, he would have been an NCAA champ. So I think it's important, and this goes back to that quote from Confucius, is that if we can ask questions and get our freaking ego out of the way, we can make shit a little bit better for our athletes. I think we've got to make sure that we're doing that. So when we evaluate the athletes, we can look at where they're at in the context of where they're at in their specific sport, and then make progress moving forward, and then consistently do that and consistently document everything. So when we're evaluating athletes specifically to endurance, okay, I like to look at VO2 max, okay, I like to look at heart rate, I like to look at how they're recovering on a daily basis. I like to look at sport coach communication, which is huge, and I know a lot of us don't like talking to sport coaches because we think they're stupid, but we should talk to them more. And I like to use benchmark testing. Okay, so what is VO2 max? And I did want to share this. I'm wearing, in this picture, a VO2, it's called a VO2 Master, and I was walking around downstairs. They're actually here. And up until like 5 years ago, to get your VO2 max tested, it would be a huge pain to go get your VO2 max test, okay? But this tool is actually very, very accurate, and it's really accessible for a university, I would say. For a university, it's very, if you are coaching at a university and you're coaching any sport with a lick of endurance, you should have a VO2 Master because it's easy for you to get readings back on how high or low their VO2 max is. And so that's one aspect I did want to bring up, is that it's an extremely effective tool that can show you, okay, if I'm working with a wrestling team or I'm working with a football team, where do I need them to be when we're performing, when we've seen in the past how the best performance? Okay, so you can test them by evaluating their VO2 max. I would have loved to use that in Pete's scenario to see what his problem was and what his VO2 max was. And because that can also give you more readings on how he's handling stress mentally, because a sport like wrestling is also extraordinarily stressful mentally as well. Another thing, heart rate. Okay, this is another aspect that I think if you can get a chest strap, or if you can get your athletes to get a chest strap, or if you're at a university, universities, I don't know why they don't all have chest straps for heart rate monitoring, but I think that's another big aspect to help you evaluate their endurance, is that you can start to use things, even in the case for like football, okay? I would want to see, let's say we're running a 2-minute drill with a football team, and we run a 2-minute drill with an O-line, and we go down the field, and it takes us a minute and a half. I want to see how quickly, once that drive is done, within 60 seconds, where's everybody's heart rate at, okay? And if we have a means of seeing how everybody's heart rate is dropping or not dropping, then we can give specific protocols based off of their recovery heart rate. Okay, so that's a big concept there. And I do have, even in this case, the lower than 150 beats per minute. What this means here is if I have the wrestlers go onto an assault bike for 30 minutes at 70 RPMs, I want to see them do that with their heart rate staying under 150 the entire time, okay? Because that way we can see for the most part they're going to be in only using their aerobic system. Okay, so that's some means of evaluation there. So the next thing that we're going to look at would be recovery observation. So in the recovery observation, I'm going to first see how sore they are. That means you have to talk to your athletes. Yo, are you really sore today or not sore today? What do you feel about yesterday's workout? We're going to see, we can also see what's your nutritional intake like? Are you cutting or not cutting? If you're a weightlifter and you have to lift really heavy weight and you're cutting weight, it's tough to hold strength and to hold that process as effectively as possible. So we have to be aware of that. What's their performance like week over week? That's another aspect of evaluation here. At the collegiate level and the professional level, how much are they drinking? Meaning alcohol, not water. How much alcohol are they drinking? And then ask to see their sleep analysis, because that's another way to factor into how well they're recovering. Now, going further here, some of the biggest, and I'm going to say this probably a couple different times, the biggest success that we've had working with South Dakota State is that South Dakota State, since we've been working with them, have set school records in number of NCAA qualifiers to the NCAA tournament for wrestling, number of All-Americans, and the amount of team points scored at the NCAA tournament. And a lot of that is because on a weekly basis, I have to talk to Damian Hahn and I have to talk to Cody Caldwell. Every single week talking with them about what's going on in the room and what they see in the room. That's an important thing to see how the athlete feels and also how the coach sees what the athlete's performance is. And then on top of that, using things like, okay, the heart rate monitor, but also GPS tracking. If there's a Division I strength coach in here, you likely have a GPS monitor. Think about everybody probably sees the sports bras that you can wear and you can see how far an athlete is running in a given practice. That needs to be part of the evaluation for when you're trying to develop the entire system. Okay, then getting into, this is going to be, benchmark discussion is going to be probably the deepest part of the easiest implementation that we can implement or that we can use here coming out of this presentation is determining sport-specific tests that are sort of like the key lifts, the key exercises, the key tests that a specific sport will use or that an athlete from a specific sport will show a success rate that we can then use and apply to other athletes coming into that sport. I'll clarify that wasn't the best explanation. We want to evaluate athlete needs on testing performance, and then we can just look at their benchmark performance relative to other individual athletes. So we can get into, what I want to get into now is how can we apply this to a training system? Okay, so when we're looking at applying this to a training system, we created a system known as a sport depth system, which is what the rest of this discussion is going to be based off of, on how you guys can take this and apply it directly today. But basically what it is, it's helped me sort of categorize the sports into 5 groups and train someone like a soccer goalie or an ice hockey goalie the same way I would train a discus thrower. And yes, that's really tightly close to how they should be training. Okay, versus someone who's a long jumper training like a wide receiver. Okay, that would be another sport depth. And then a wrestler would train similar to somebody who's a professional canoeer. And yes, professional canoers do exist. So it's the system helps simplify training a large population of different athletes, and it's exactly what we've implemented into our app with Peak Strength and how we go through studying the energy systems, studying the intensity, the duration of competition, and then how we apply that. So now I want to get into all the application stuff. I want you to scan this, and this will be like a 12-page, it's a free 12-page PDF, and it has like all the information, like more in depth around what this is. But after this, okay, so if you can think about the presentation as like, we've taken sort of like big picture concept ideas, sort of more abstract, and then we've mined down into like the specifics around energy systems, the specifics around physiology, and then getting into how you evaluate them, and then even from this, the next aspect is going to be getting into how we can apply this and create a week layout, a template, and then actual protocols and endurance protocols that you guys could apply, if you really wanted to go home tomorrow, you could put your athletes through some specific protocols. Also, I think they didn't have chairs in here. I think they thought you guys were going to do some workouts or something. We should have run like a CrossFit class. That would have been fun. Jacob, burpees for the rest of the hour. Okay, so, man, they really changed these colors. Trevor's going to be upset. Trevor helped design the graphics on all this. He's going to be like, why would they put white font on a white background? Okay, so you can see this is how we lay out sport depths, okay? If I have an athlete come to my gym, and our gym is like total chaos constantly, literally, from the time athletes start coming in until the end of the day, it's mayhem, okay? So if we have athletes come in, and I have someone come in and it's let's say a shot putter, okay? I was actually just telling Gary about how there's a 6th grade girl that has been training with me that I'm like, she's gonna be an Olympic champion. Gary said I was crazy for saying that, but I swear it's actually true. Anyway, if she's training and she's in the strength and power sport depth, I know how she's gonna be training based off of the sport depth system, and I can train her at the exact same moment that I might be training an 800-meter runner, okay? And I can think through the lens of how that would look in an applied scenario. And so the first aspect here, sport depth 1 is going to be strength and power. These are going to be the athletes that are power lifters, weight lifters, shot putters, discus throwers, goalies, anything along those lines. These athletes in general, for the most part, the needs that they would have endurance-wise are going to be based around sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. So we're going to be doing some type of bodybuilding work inside their strength system, inside their strength days. The other aspects are going to be, okay, how can we improve their aerobic capacity to a point in certain times of the year just to make sure that they're remaining somewhat healthy, okay? And so we might do some cyclical work. And then most importantly for recovery, I believe there is some evidence that even doing something like taking advantage of heat shock proteins from going into the sauna, if you have access to a sauna. For us, we're fortunate we have a sauna at the gym. So our throwers are always going in the sauna 4 to 5 days a week. I do believe that plays an impact on their endurance. So that's what is needed for them. Now, what that looks like as far as an analysis system, okay, is that if you're training a soccer goalie or if you're training a shot putter, this would be optimal, okay? This VO2 max score of 40 or 50, 40 to 45 or 50 would be optimal. That's pretty high for that type of sport, but it would be optimal. We want to pay attention to how they're recovering on a day-to-day basis. And then we want to also just make sure the most important aspect is ask the sport coaches, how well are they taking throw number 10 versus throw number 15 versus throw 25? How well is the goalie playing in 70 minutes versus 30 minutes or 80 minutes versus 40 minutes, okay? Asking those questions. And that's going to be an important part here. Now, when we're looking at this sport depth, okay, the sport coach discussion is going to go back to essentially leading to what type of endurance you're going to be using. And for this example, it's mostly always going to be sarcoplasmic work, okay? The thing that you guys can take from today is say, okay, if I have a football, or if I have a, not football player, if I have a shot putter or a ice hockey goalie or a field hockey goalie, we need to test them on these lifts. These lifts are literally all that matters, okay? So going back over it, when I'm training somebody, we're looking through the 4 key factors, okay? And we're looking at strength, explosiveness, speed, and endurance. And in this case, this is all that matters, okay? Literally using just these examples. And what we've done is we've compiled all of this research, okay, from actual peer-reviewed journals, from research on site at Garage Strength, and from discussions with other sport coaches to say like, okay, this is probably gonna be the best movements that predict how explosive these athletes are gonna be, because really that's all we gotta focus on with Sport Depth 1. Where the endurance work comes into play is that the endurance plays a major role in their recovery, in the volume that they handle on a big scheme, like on a regular basis, on a daily basis. And so this is literally how we lay out an exact week. So 5 athletes are going to Paris in 2 weeks. I'm going with them. This is the program that they would follow, literally to a T, okay? This is actually their specific program. This is also going to be coming out inside of our app, Peak Strength. Head over to the Google Drive store or the Google Play store and the Apple iOS store if you want to download Peak Strength. So here you can see, okay, we've got competitive reps. That's going to be the sport-specific group, lower body lift, and then the hypertrophy aspect. The hypertrophy option is not an option on if they can do it, it's an option on what they're doing specifically in that. So if they have a, in Sam's case, a pec issue, we're going to do work in that localized area. Okay, if we have somebody that has a lower back problem, we're going to do a lot of hypertrophy work on their lower back. Okay, if we have a knee issue, we're probably going to do a lot of hypertrophy in the quad or hamstrings dependent. Okay, so that's how we set up that week. And then the easy endurance option, this is going to be like if a ratio might, for us, we typically will follow a 5-to-1 ratio, meaning for every 5 days that they train, they have to hit one session of endurance work. And that one session might only be 15 minutes, but that one session could be 15 minutes on the assault bike at 55 RPM, or 50 RPMs for a strength and power athlete. Okay, and then we get into the rest of it. Not a ton, but I actually just got one of the VO2 Masters and I'm gonna play around with it because I use it a lot. So I want to do more of that. Most of those numbers I took out of the applied book and was like, okay, these are pretty real, decent numbers. I still think they're a little high. Yeah.
So, saying that you're doing your VO2 testing with this group, how would you go about doing that? Because if you were to do a run, could you?
I wouldn't do it on a run. I would do it on an assault bike or I would do it on a rower. And I would make sure every time the test would be the same. And I would set it up. Unless they're goalies, if they're a soccer goalie, I would probably be willing to do it that way. If they are a thrower, think about the picture of Daniel. Dude's 330, 340, he's got flat feet, he's not running. Or if he is, he's dying on the run. I would just be, I would say try to use a consistent test and knowing that, okay, if we can test them on an assault bike, and let's say we slowly build it up, the RPMs every 2 minutes. Okay, so if you'd go 2 minutes at let's just do an example of 55 RPMs, and then 2 minutes at 59 RPMs, then 2 minutes and you just build up until they basically quit, which will happen around 15 to 20 minutes at that tempo, maybe a little bit earlier. Then you're gonna get a good reading back on what their VO2 max is, and then you can take protocols okay, they're in the range, that's okay. Or if they're not in the range, what can we do? We should add a little bit of cyclical endurance in there just because they will recover quicker. And I know some of the research on that is a little, does endurance help recovery for a strength athlete? It's a little bit back and forth, but I also think there's a value in anecdote of I train a lot of throwers and I know that when we do a lot more aerobic work, I can see that they are recovering better. Steph, I didn't even see you there. Wait, is that Steph Lodge? No, it's not Steph Lodge. Oh my God, I thought that was Steph Lodge. I'm so sorry. I apologize for that. Jesus, I'm an idiot. Okay, next question. Yeah.
So when you're talking about endurance-based strategies, are you doing more long, slow aerobic work, or are you incorporating?
For this depth,
Yeah, for this depth, there's work.
all of their work would be slow work.
Long, slow work.
Yeah, unless randomly they're yo, I want to go really hard and see if I can get my VO2 max up. That's the one downfall of the VO2 max test, is that you will have athletes who just want to get a higher score. So then that's a downfall, is yo, we don't need to test your VO2 max to get you up to 55. Someone like Sam probably could get to that if we did it properly.
Have you done some intervals with them? Do you feel
Yes, in the fall, so this past fall, we did very specific work on improving our group's back squat, okay, for 12 weeks. And during that timeline, we had one athlete, actually I don't know if you can remember back to the picture, Taman, he was a shot putter, and it was should you run with this group? And he wanted to do interval work on Friday because then he had Saturday off to not do anything. And then Sunday he would come in and do his leg lifts. He was okay by having that day off, okay? But if you're gonna do an interval work, I would just do it on a bike or on a rower. I think the best specific work for them would be getting them on a rower, because most athletes that are strength and power based, like a power lifter or a weight lifter or a thrower, any type of extra mobility work, and honestly, I see like a concept 2 rower as like increasing their hip mobility while you're still doing some aerobic work. So that actually can lead, and I've even seen guys like Taman actually who has had knee issues, his knees will get better from being a little bit more mobile from the rower. So I think that's another thing to bring in. Yeah.
I was wondering why you specifically use like the sauna for endurance training. Yeah, because I personally don't understand.
Okay, so the sauna for endurance training. Why do I use the sauna for endurance training? So when they sit, let's say we go into the sauna, it's at 170 degrees Fahrenheit, you sit in there for 30 minutes, you should have some adaptation based off of the research of heat shock proteins and how you're recovering from that stimulation. That should help with mitochondrial volume, and it should help with your recovery from the lifting session that you might have done 20 to 30 minutes earlier. So they'll do a hard lift, like a hard upper body lift, do mobility, and then they go into the sauna, and then after the sauna, they go shower. So that's like factored into their recovery / endurance. Okay, now I think that mic's working. Does anybody else have questions on this? Yes.
So when you're working with a strength and power-based athlete, would you prioritize endurance work within their strength program or within their like LSD work? So like an example, like an Olympic weightlifter is getting gassed on their 6th pound for clean and jerk, or a thrower is super gassed on their like 6th throw, or a powerlifter is super gassed on their 8th, 9th lift. And you're seeing like some kind of localized fatigue, but that's being caused by your lack of endurance. Would you prioritize focusing that localized fatigue like within their strength training, like on minute work, or within LSD work?
So if I see a localized issue in their lower back, I would put that into their actual strength work. That's where I would even say, like, let's say someone's benching, and if you see like a baseball player, they bench, let's say they're doing like 5 sets, and they start to like rotate like this. I would specifically target like rotator cuff, literally hypertrophy work. Like I would find bodybuilding exercises that we can hit super high reps on in that situation. I would even use, in the case of a weightlifter, I wanted to talk about the on the minute aspect, because I do think this, okay, so for a weightlifter, on the minute would mean, and this has a huge application to football. And I'll talk about this in the next group because football comes up next. On the minute work would mean like we hit a clean, okay, and then you drop the bar, and when you drop the bar, you hit a 60-second timer, and then you do that again, and you do that every single minute, like every 60 seconds, okay? So that for a weightlifter in this case, we would use the program prior to a peak. So, Haley was a world bronze medalist in clean jerk. She clean jerked 110, which is 242 when she weighed 49 kilos, so like 108 pounds. Some of the things that we would do to make sure that she could hit like 108 to 110 all the time is that last 8 weeks, we would go like week 8, 7, 6, 5, 4 on the minutes on Fridays, so that she would get into a groove and not think about the weight on the bar, and that would help with her endurance. That's like a strength endurance. That's literally like a specific scenario for her. Like that's specific endurance to the sport. Now that's specific to weightlifting, but does anybody have any other questions with strength and power? Because I do want to, yeah.
This may be off the topic of endurance training, but for the competitive rep days, are you switching between high intensity, low intensity, or are you keeping those competitive reps?
Okay, that's a good question. I think that would be dependent on the sport coach, first of all. For me, with throwers, like I'm training throwers like every day, right? So the way I have been playing around with this would be, and this is where, not scientific. Day 1 is smash mode, okay? Day 2 we set up cones where they have to throw in a range. Okay, so let's say Taman's throwing an 18 or 20-pound shot. Okay, he has to take 24 throws with the 20-pound shot between 16 and 17 meters, and they all have to land there, and he can't leave until he's done. And that's a sport-specific endurance example, okay, because he's throwing a heavier implement, and he's got to hit all in that same range. So that would be a range day. The third day is a range day. Day 4, we do drill throw day, so it's lower intensity on day 4. Okay, so day 4, drill, drill, throw, drill, drill, throw, drill, drill, throw. Then day 5, if we are, usually day 5s would then be a Friday, and then it's like full-blown smash mode again. So on day 5, and we would measure day 1 and we would measure day 5, and then the range is set up like how consistent can your technique be. I don't know if that's your question. I know that's a specific scenario for throwing.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, just seeing how you switch between the competitive reps and
Yeah, the thing is I want them to go full send before they do a leg lift, because the leg lift is going to be taxing for them. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah. Need multiple cubes.
So for throwers, for instance, you mentioned something like 15 minutes on these easy endurance options, is that correct?
Uh-huh.
15 minutes? So are you at all, like throughout the course of the season, like periodizing that for these guys at all, or are you basing it off of, I don't know, early season stuff or anything?
No, it'd be programmed in there, yeah. And okay, so that's a good question, because using Sam's example, you know how I mentioned him throwing in the morning before the final? Okay, so what we do, part of what we do leading into a peak is like, we don't really pull out like, we don't use linear periodization. Okay, we literally will be like the week of, he's hitting like a power snatch at 120, 130. That's not like super heavy for him, but it's still pretty heavy. He'll hit a single on bench at like 190 on a Monday, and he might compete on Friday. But what we did do is we removed the hypertrophy work. So we move sarcoplasmic work 3 to 4 weeks out. We remove endurance work 2 to 3 weeks out. Unless he really wants to do something easy just as a warm-up, the rest of it is like we take all that stuff out. So now that load comes off of him, and then he starts to feel like an absolute freak, right? So that's where we sort of play around with those more so. And I don't think that, at least in my experience, I haven't seen that in most power athletes. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Question about navigating these gray areas. Sometimes this comes on the coaching communication. You'll have a power athlete on a field team like a goalie is being evaluated by coaching staff or the field players. How do you structure their training to make them happy from a coaching perspective that this athlete is moving, closer towards a test goal or 15 goal while still hitting those targets?
That's a tough one.
Honestly, the lenses of evaluation that we can have as strength coaches.
This is soccer?
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, I would use like professional examples. Like the Argentinian goalie, it has like a 36, 37-inch vertical. He's not going out for runs, so he shouldn't be evaluated the same way as a midfielder. A midfielder is going to be running 5 to 6 miles in a game, whereas a goalie might be running like literally like 50 yards, right? I mean, maybe a little bit more than that, but I would say like it's different needs. And that goes back to the beginning of like, what is the need of the athlete? And I don't know if you can communicate to that to the sport coach or not. Like, look, we got to look at these a little differently. This is the need for this goalie. We need to get him to have a better vertical jump. We need to get him to be able to cover a smaller area than the rest of the players. So where he's living is literally more like a linebacker or a bigger, more explosive tennis player to a point. I don't know how to, a tennis player might not be the best example because they have a little bit more endurance. I don't know how, I would argue, I would do my best to communicate that as clearly as possible to the sport coach, without ruffling feathers. Because then it's just like, all right, well, I would just bring him back and probably put him in, when we get into sport depth, 3 or 4. Okay, so the next one, this would be sport depth 2, is going to be speed and power. And this is going to be locomotive-based sports. And this is like where we would see football players, and when we say speed, I literally think about running, okay? Not as far as like, when, somebody might think speed with dynamic effort stuff. I think about locomotive work, and speed is actually running. Okay, so they're gonna have more running, and then you can see the percentages up there on the board. And when we were writing the program, I'm thinking through, okay, what percentage, and I'm not, this is one good part about having the app, is that when we're laying out these programs, we can look at the app and say, okay, we need this much percentage based on where our athletes are in the sport depth. So they're gonna have a little bit longer rest periods, okay, 30 to, some of these athletes, if they're a track and field jumper, they might have a rest period that's, 5 to 7 minutes, okay, so it's gonna be a little bit longer. Now with football, it will be, 30 to 45 seconds, depending on the play. Baseball, softball, they're gonna be a little bit longer. Okay, so they need to be as explosive as possible. So the endurance aspects here are still going to be mainly cyclical, I would argue, or I would want to communicate with the sport coach to see what they're doing with their competitive reps in the sport. Okay, how much time are they doing with their offense? If we're specifically talking about a football player, I would want to know how much ground they're covering and how much time they're spending on that to factor into the ratio. So for examples here, we would want to see now, this number here, 54 for an O lineman, I think would be pretty aggressive, but I do think these numbers are realistic for the other athletes. Recovery, we're looking at some specific stuff there. How well are they recovering from session to session? How are they recovering when they go from a football practice to coming into hitting a lift? How well do they recover there? And then when I would be working with sprinters or jumpers, here, I want to know how well are they running in the quarterfinals versus the semifinals versus the finals. Okay, so if we know that, I'll use this example. A lot of the issues people had, this kid Quincy Wilson, who just got sixth at the Olympic trials in the 400 meters, people had a lot of concern, and he broke two youth world records. Okay, he ran like a 44.56, if I remember correctly. A lot of people were like, hey, he's a high schooler. He's not going to have the endurance. He's going to be toast by the time he gets to the final. And he got to the final and he ran like 99.7% of his PR. So he didn't have an endurance issue. He has a speed issue. He doesn't really have any issues because he's 16 and he made the Olympics. But looking at it through the lens relative to the other athletes, that's where he could sort of have that low-hanging fruit. He also just needs to grow a little bit more. So that's like some things that I would do as far as being aware of recovery, how well they're recovering from round to round. Now these tests here, I think are absolutely 100% important. Now somebody like a high jumper, I wouldn't necessarily be testing them on a bench press, okay? In fact, I just would not be testing them on a bench press at all. I would test them on a 40 and a 20-yard shuttle, because that's gonna show a lot on what their capability is on their takeoff, okay? Everything else, I would be testing them on a regular basis, and this would be done quarterly. The tests are done quarterly. And so this would be how that week is laid out. And I did want to say too, this is like the type of endurance that's up here right now. I'm going to have some examples later on as well that we'll get into, that you'll see like specific examples. So this would be like a layout of a football team here. Like technique work, technical work, maybe some game simulation on day 2 here, and then some situational simulations here, more technique work on day 4 and day 5. And this would probably be more so done during preseason, not in season. They would not be supplemental training this much in season. This would be like in May, May or June. Does anybody have any questions about this? I would really, if you are at a university, GPS studies is a big thing. Like at Penn State, Chuck Losey's got mileage and top speed rankings, and that's where stuff like those resources can be pretty fun to play around with. Now, in a private setting, they're worthless. It's just like a money pit. You're not going to make money off of that. You had a question? Yeah.
With athletes, so I've got some experience with RSI, or any other tests that are not on there.
So with a sprinter, I would look at probably specifically, what's their flying time from like 30 to 70 meters. If we have a 100-meter guy, I like to break down a sprint into different points and see, okay, if they have GPS on, when are they achieving their peak velocity? Okay, so let's say Usain Bolt hit like 65 to 75 meters peak velocity. He could hold that to right around like 85 to 90 meters, and then he would tail off. Part of the reason he tail off is he might be, he doesn't need to continue to run hard. So in this case, you would look at it, in this example, theoretically, right? You can break that down and say, okay, could he achieve max velocity slightly sooner and then hold that longer? I think too, it depends. You asked me about testing. I'm getting too into sprint stuff, but I think that I've always struggled with something like RSI because I'm in a gym where we have a lot of athletes coming in, a lot of kids, and then like, dude, we gotta make money. Like, I don't have time to like test all those little cool, like, dude, a lot of that stuff's cool, but it's not practical for me. I can find out their RSI based off their vertical and then looking at their broad jump and then looking at their tripled broad jump with 2 legs, right? Like, I can see that might be a weakness based off of that. Now, I might not have the exact data, and I'm not saying that data is worthless. I'm just saying for me, in my situation, it's not as easy for me to accomplish that when I have to deal with paying a mortgage and stuff. Yeah.
Can you ask it into the microphone, please, so viewers at home can hear? Thank you.
What constitutes an athlete day?
Okay, so athlete day, that's a great question. Athlete day is what we would refer to as like plyometric work. And in this case, let's say we got a linebacker and he struggles to move laterally here and then change direction moving forward. So we might set up like plyometric jump series based off of that. And that's actually, not that we would be using RSI to develop the series, but I would use film and use discussion with the athlete and the coaches, like where does this kid suck? Like, we need to make sure we can improve this. So it's all jumps. It's all plyometric jumps.
More specific to the athlete.
Yes, entirely specific. So athlete day would be, what is their sport? How well are they moving? Where are they moving poorly? Is there a range of motion that they're struggling with? One example would be, we could get into this in the next one. There's like some very specific full depth plyometrics that we might use to develop a wrestler. But some athletes don't need that as much because they might not be in that full depth at higher speed. So we might only train in the specific range of motion to that athlete. I did want to bring up here, based off of a football player, I think this is my one big thing. So we had a left tackle that played at Bloomsburg. He was preseason All-American. This is going back like 2015, 2016. Going into the season, he would always struggle. I mean, he's a big dude, so he's a little lazy too, but he would always just feel like he didn't have the best endurance. And we went into his camp. He hit 15 singles on the minute between 160 kilos and 170 kilos. And the reason why we would do that, okay, so on the minute, so he's hitting a clean at 350 plus pounds, dropping it, we're timing him for a minute. We want to see, okay, how well is he able to apply force over that 15-minute time frame to emulate what that would be like getting into playing the first quarter. And we knew that if he could do that for that first 15 minutes, we didn't need to push more past that, but that would be a very specific case for dealing with football players in general, especially that load would be a little bit heavier for O-linemen. It would be a little bit lighter for our running back. It would be a little bit lighter for our wide receiver, but it would be another way that we can use on the minute work for their endurance. For interval sprints, I do think you could test them with some interval sprints and keep the rest a little bit shorter, maybe like a minute to a minute and a half. In the case of football players, yeah.
Just as an example, say you're using on a minute with a lineman, are you tracking bar speed to?
Yes and no. I think Yes and no. I would in some cases. And accessibility, it's like if we have enough of the tool available, we only have 2 of them. So in that case, like if you have a school and you have 20 racks that have them, use it, yeah. And I would keep it probably at like, I would probably keep it at like 1.7. That might be a little fast, but like, I mean, that's probably pretty good, yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm trying to think, you know, if we were looking at, like that's where like even a snatch, I'd say try and keep it over 2 meters per second for a power snatch. And that would be, I actually think if you can teach your athletes, your football guys how to snatch, I actually think it's a really good tool to use in season because the load will be a lot lighter, but they'll still feel good. But you got to make sure they're technically proficient. Does anybody have any questions regarding football specifically? Yeah. Or it doesn't have to be football either. It can be any other sport, sorry.
Yeah, in terms of off-season running, particularly for offensive linemen, what's your take on it? Like more aerobic stuff for your bigger guys?
Okay, so I think that if you weigh over 275, you should be on an assault bike. You should be on a Concept 2. And I will say this, you know, after COVID especially, I feel like companies came out with a lot of good tools to use for endurance work. Ski ergs, obviously, I know they existed prior to COVID, but I just feel like they got more popular and easier to access. I also am a huge fan of treadmills. A lot of like the running world in general, they don't necessarily like treadmills, but if we look at the fact that a treadmill for an O lineman will drastically decrease their ground reaction force, which will enable them to handle that running a little bit if they really want to run. And in that case, the goal is to we're training their heart and how well that they can either one, have more of the mitochondrial adaptation, or 2, greater cardiac output. And in this case on a treadmill, I think it's perfectly fine that they would do that. You know, there's a lot of football players too that do run in the off season that are heavier than what I said, and they're okay. I think it's just, you've got to monitor that and make sure. I think you can sort of handle the bigger dudes on an assault bike or on a rower or something like that, or even pushing a sled. I think that's another thing too that we can use to take advantage of for that population. I think with the hills, I'm jumping ahead. I think with like linemen, I actually like to put them on hills if they're running, and maybe expedite their rest period on hill sprints more so. Yeah. Okay, so if we go into, does anybody else have anything? Going into the sport depth, the third sport depth here. So this is the wrestlers, essentially, this is like the wrestler one. I call this the Keystone sport depth. It should be called the combat sport depth mainly because we're looking at combat sports, but because I love Pennsylvania so much, I called it the Keystone because we're also really good at wrestling, like I mentioned earlier. So in this case, we're looking at a lot of their endurance work. Earlier in the year is going to be long, slow distance work. We want to get them actually tested in a 5K. We want to get them running. If they're okay with running, I want them to run 6+ miles 1 to 3 times a week. So we will do that. And a lot of their endurance then, as we get closer to the season, it starts to switch into more interval-based work. And they also will do a lot of sarcoplasmic work as well. Okay, so that's what we got to think through with that lens. Then we would bring in rowing and climbing as well into this, along with, if you think about somebody in MMA, in boxing, anything along those lines. This is where I would really recommend testing VO2 max. And actually one thing right now with South Dakota State, because I'm not there with them, they're actually in the process of trying to get that set up in their lab that they could do this quarterly. The one thing too is that in a sport like wrestling, if we can get their heart rate elevated and test them when they're doing like a scramble, and then see how much their heart rate drops, that can play a pretty big role in their success. And obviously talking with the coach. The coach says, hey, this kid always, sort of peters out in the third period. Well, if that happens, then we know, let's try to increase their overall endurance volume, see if we can do that for 4 to 6 weeks, and then backdoor them with interval work once or twice a week and see how that plays out. I think that's a really important aspect. And I did want to bring up here, outside of this example that I just provided, is that this is where, if you remember back to the image of Tanner in the beginning, getting his hand raised, one thing we do quite a bit is that we will do a lot of work with the wrestlers on sparring. Okay, so they call it sparring. I would refer to it as like flow wrestling. Okay, so they actually will wrestle for 30 to 40 minutes straight. And that's where it's like, if they could keep their heart rate at like 60 to 70%, literally for 30 to 40 minutes, that's technical work. That's them with a partner just hitting positions, and they're not doing anything crazy, but they're doing very specific work, okay? And they're doing that at least once a week. And at the high school level, it's a really good way to learn that skill of wrestling, right? So if you have somebody in this realm, that can be something really unique to test. Now, I did want to bring up here, when we test the 5K, we actually look at their 1 mile splits as well. So we want to see, okay, what's their 5K time frame, but then also how quickly or how are they repeating that. And I wanted to bring this up. It's like, if we have kids, we had a couple heavyweights where it's like, just from doing long, slow distance work, so just consistently having even heavyweights, go on the treadmill. Okay, you got to run multiple times a week, three sets of 5 miles. Okay, 3 5-mile runs in a week. That way, if they come out and they're running their 5K at like 31, 32 minutes, which is pretty freaking slow for a collegiate wrestler. Now they're heavyweights, but still, that's pretty slow. And their heart rate was around like 150 to 155. Okay, and then they come back just recently and test again, and those same guys are running at 27 minutes, and their heart rate was at 150 to 155. There's no tap into their glycolytic system. That's literally still all the aerobic system, and all that's happening in that case is they're just developing greater aerobic capacity. So we can see an increase in their rate without really having any negative byproducts like lactate. Not that the lactate's negative, but it can be, especially in a sport like wrestling. And so I think that's a good example of how to use, if you can get the splits on something like a 5K, you can implement that pretty well. I just noticed that they did not, I'm pretty sure we had sent in the weekly layout here, but that's not on this slide. So does anybody have any questions about this specifically? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's where we would use, and you'll see this later in the applied part, is like, or in the specific workouts. I would use salt bikes. I would do, let's say 5 1,000 meter repeats on a salt bike with only about 2 minutes rest. Okay, I would use a rower, let's say something simple there, like a 500, it's like get a decent 500 meter time for them, and maybe you decrease by 10%, and you say, okay, we need to get on the rower. Let's just say theoretically they do a 2 minute 500 meter row. Okay, well let's do this at 220, 215 for the next 45 minutes, and they've got to execute that. I would 100% do that. The other thing is, in the row, in the assault bike, using a full body pattern like that can have a really big impact, because a lot of wrestlers will say, and this is where sarcoplasmic hypertrophy comes into play, when wrestlers are in a big match and they come off, their arms feel like they've got the pump, they've got it. And if we can emulate that in practice and in the gym, that's going to help them feel more confident when they're in overtime and they've got to hit a position to score. So using a rower, using an assault bike will play into that as well. No, it's not. Okay. We would see, the big factor is like their day one is usually when they are going to be going live. Okay, it's actually similar to throwing. Okay, so day one, they're going live and they're hammering it and they're going pretty hard. Okay, so that day we're not going to hit anything. We're not going to do any type of cardio. On day two, they're doing technique work in the morning. Then they go in the gym in the afternoon and they've got to hit LSD work. So like real simple work. So the amount of time for them is how we base the volume. So if we can see that as they get closer into the season, they've got 240 minutes with the athletes, just supplemental training throughout the week. Then we have to figure out, okay, is this kid, and this is where the benchmarks comes in. We get the test, and we have a spider graph here, okay? And we can see off the spider graph, okay, this kid's power clean was bad, his broad jump's bad, and his single leg squat's bad, but his cardio is really good. His 5K, his test is good in the 5K, and his pull-ups are good, okay? Which is a really common thing with with wrestlers. Okay, well, let's increase his, he never wins scrambles because he's slow. Okay, well, we need to make him more explosive based off of that feedback. Now, if we have an athlete that is really explosive, a kid, Cade DeVos this year, super explosive, not the greatest with his endurance, we could see his 5K test isn't that good, especially relative to the other guys his weight class. Okay, well, let's try to take out, instead of having Cade lift 4 days a week, let's have Cade lift 3 days a week because he doesn't need as much resistance training because his other tests, bench press, pull-ups, broad, power clean are all good. Let's add in an extra day of cardio work here. And they're getting in the sauna 3 to 4 days a week all the time. Okay, so then we would say, all right, how is Cade period to period? Okay, can he recover from period to period? Yeah, he's pretty good. Okay, well, how is Cade coming out of a scramble? Well, when he comes out of a scramble, he usually he wants injury timeout. Okay, well, if he comes out of a scramble and he needs injury timeout, let's increase his interval work. So now we increase his interval training. Now, if he struggles with like period 1 versus period 3 he sucks, that's probably where we would increase his total volume time-wise, meaning we might have him on the assault bike for 90 minutes twice a week, and that's going to help him throughout the entire match, and his interval work will still be fine. Does that make sense? Okay. Use volume of running. I don't think that they should be running more than 25 miles a week, and I would even argue if you're over 184, I think like 15 to 20 miles is plenty, because they're still doing enough work on the bikes and on these guys will go into the weight room and sit on an assault bike for 30 minutes for fun. So it's like, I think knowing that, some of the lighter weight guys will literally run themselves into stress fractures, because they might have been a cross-country kid growing up or anything like that, and they just really like to run. So I would use that as an example where it's like, maybe 20 to 25 up till about 165 weight class. And then below 165, I'd say 20 to 15 miles. Just because it can be quite a bit. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So with this group of athletes, how practical would be doing a 5K run to test their endurance? Because like with these athletes, you're taking like wrestlers, for example, and doing a 5K run, you could argue that, yes, you are testing their aerobic capabilities, but their running efficiency is also going to impact that score. And like in their competition,
they're not running as much.
For example, they're not running continuous, sprinting. So that also at that aspect, how important?
I wouldn't say it would be sprinting though. I would agree with.
Like that high intensity, it's more like an explosive versus a slower distance.
Yeah.
Your 5K, which is at like a VO2. And then also kind of going off that, I know, big question. Really, how important is that VO2 versus, let's say, lactate threshold?
Okay, I would argue that if they have a high VO2 max, their lactate threshold would be higher based off of where they're at. I think that if you're in that case, it's like, okay, do we have a lactate meter and we can see during a match, like when do they get to 6 millimoles versus when they get past 2? Like how intense. I think that would be a hard measurement for me to justify versus once a quarter. Cody, can we test them on the VO2 master versus, looking at what intensity when they're doing their flow wrestling, do we see their millimoles go past 2.0? Because that's when they're going to start to use their glycolytic system. So that would be my answer to the second part. The first part I would agree with in the sense that it's not exactly what they're doing on the mat. And I would just keep in mind that most of this is going to be done right after the season, again right now, this week in July, and then again right before the season. So it's more so to like keep them honest, because they have to record their mileage, they have to record their efforts in the gym, and that's one of the big concepts here is like, if they know we're testing it, they know that they're gonna hold themselves more accountable to do the work. Now, I also think that in your case, I would agree with you. I actually think the 5 by 1,000 meter repeats on an assault bike is the best test. And I think it's one of the best workouts that they can do. Like, how quickly can you get 1,000 meters done on an assault bike in 1:23, and can you hold that for every single bout with only a minute rest? I don't know if that makes sense to you for what you had asked the first part. I think that's a good question. Yeah, and I just think too, it's like a 5K run's pretty easy for them to go out with as a team and be like, okay, we're gonna do a plyometric warm up, and then the team runs it together. It's part of like team bonding stuff too. That does factor in, and when we do have to think of that as a strength coach. Does anybody else have any questions with this? Yeah.
The kind of benchmark of like 20 miles per week, is this in season while they are wrestling?
No, this would be more out of season. In season, they would not be running that much. This is like making sure, in my opinion, I think the biggest ground to make up at the elite level for wrestlers is endurance. And I think the area that that I have made specifically is that I've always thought, like, I can get in shape in 6 to 8 weeks, but it's not that way. It's a compounding effect. If we can do endurance constantly, and we can build up the VO2 max, and even the lactate threshold, if we're testing with the meters, if we can do that consistently for a couple years, that's where we're gonna see a lot of improvement. So with that being said, most of that running volume is gonna be out of season to keep them focused on building that, because a lot of them might go home, at least around July 4th, and then again, after they do testing this week, they go home. So there's gonna be like 3 weeks that they're not at school, and that's like the easiest thing that they can do when they're at home to maintain that endurance. Now, when they come back in season, they do a lot of, on Monday after they do their live wrestling, they're going hard conditioning, like interval work in the gym or in the room as well. So that also does play into it.
I've got one more question. You mentioned when you're looking at some of this data for assessment that somebody is week here. Do you use your own like normative data for that, or you make how are you kind of making?
Wait, say this again. I'm trying to.
When you're looking at the assessments and you're saying this person's weak in the broad jump, weak in the vertical jump, are you using your own data for that?
Yeah, we're using everything that we've had from athletes that are, so we literally build it out where we have middle school, high school, college, professional. And then we have levels of this. Like, this is elite for all those levels. This is, okay, average, pretty standard, or this is the middle school kid that we test and we got to tell their dad they're not going D1, right? Like, that's that kid. So we have years of all this information and knowledge, and it's like, okay, how can we make this easier so that we can look at a radar graph and spit it out and go, okay, this kid, he's weak in this. So I want to make sure that we make sure, like, a good example, after the season, we went through and we tested their vertical jumps, okay? And like half the team's vertical jump was under 25. I'm like, dude, I get the season just ended, but this is terrible. Like, it's not acceptable that a wrestling team, they're in the Big 12. Like, if we can improve that, now they're going to be able to hit more explosive shots. So it was like 8 straight weeks squatting and plyometric work to really elicit this big response that we're seeing now in their vertical jump tests. So that's like it's a thing that we can then look at and compare to make sure that our training is contextual towards what their problem is. Yeah. Okay, so I don't know what time it is. I'm going to try and get through this. Oh, okay, perfect. That's good. Okay, so the sport depth 4 would be continuous go. This is I think the most challenging one to work with athletes on. Okay, this is going to be field hockey players, lacrosse players. Lacrosse especially is a big one. Basketball even is another challenging sport to deal with because of the mileage that they go through. Basketball players, I want to say around 3 to 5 miles. that they're running in a game. A recent paper, actually, that the NSCA just put out, Gaelic football, okay, almost has, and it's a very specific example. I want to say it was like 5 to 7 miles running. It has almost an identical play to lacrosse. Okay, so what I like to do is use those examples, those scenarios, to then look at, if I have these ratios on the side and I need to talk to our sport coach, I can see, okay, in practice, what do we think you're doing on day one? If they're doing a live game simulation, we know they're going to be getting a lot of volume from running, so we've got to back off of running in that case. Okay, on day 2, if they're doing more specific technical work, we can bring in some endurance work or some strength work, depending upon the weakness on those specific days. So it can be challenging because of how much volume they have. This is, again, where we would see some of the examples with VO2 max. Here would be 50 and 60 for these specific individuals. And we would even be looking again at testing. In this case, I actually like to test a 1 mile run. And the reason being in a sport like lacrosse, okay, so the lacrosse athletes that I have spoken to, and I hope somebody can maybe change this, they've always come back to me and be like, coaches love the 1 mile test for lacrosse. Okay, so we're gonna test this. We're gonna see how, one of our guys was an All-American at Ohio State, and he was like, if you could run a 6-minute mile, then you could go, then Ohio State would actually consider you. But we also need to make sure that they're doing a large amount of sprint work. We also need to make sure that they're strong enough, they have a good vertical jump, and we're just being aware of their overall practice GPS data, okay, because I think that's going to play a big role there. And then this would be how that week is laid out. So 5K testing, 1 mile run, GPS practice, GPS studies there, and then what we want to do is lay out this week here with their simulations, and this is what a week of practice might look like for them, and then we would bring that into play here. Yeah.
So you do have a VO2 max. Have you ever used a different fitness test for those sports, and then had like a cross-sectional look for like a 30-15 or a yo-yo, and then still looking at their VO2 max? Because like these sports are a little bit more
Yeah.
or do you think just simpler to do a mile test and then keep your like analyzing that?
I have never done that. I think that would be really good. I think you could look at, I was thinking through, like, based off that question, it would almost be like, if I would say in our system, in our setup, like if we would go and test, let's say we do test a 1 mile run on a Monday, and then, so are you saying do that in the exact same day?
No, just using different, instead of doing a mile, do the yo-yo.
Oh, yes. I think, I have not done that, but I think that would be very reasonable to do that. I actually even think it's important to recognize, like, in this case, how's their endurance versus their speed? And how is, if they're running a 20-yard shuttle, making sure that you're even testing to both sides and then seeing how they are on, like, test 4 versus test 5 versus test 6. So I was going to say that, but I think that's very reasonable to do that. Yeah.
How do you modify the benchmarks for positional work specifically in those sports for like goaltending?
So in that case, I would still put most of those, that would go back to the similar question earlier. I would try to bring most of the goalies in those sports into at least sport depth 2. And I would try to pitch the argument to the sport coach, and I would try to sit them down and walk through, like, data around ground coverage and length of ground coverage, and work through that situation there. I think that becomes a little bit, I think there's a lot of sport coaches that are super set in their ways, but I think that I don't think goalies in most sports and in most of these sports, they're not covering that much ground on a very constant basis. So that would be the way that I would try to deal with that. Anybody else have questions on? Yep.
Do you consider, do you consider the work that they do in their practice or sport-specific work like the endurance work, so like a field hockey player or a soccer player, as part of that percentage within your sport depth system?
Do I consider?
So like when you're looking at the endurance percentage of the training, like the training focus ratio,
Yeah.
do you consider the work that they do in practice as part of that endurance work, or is that endurance still supplemental in the like weight room?
These ratios are all supplemental based. So it's all based around, as a S&C, we're trying to supplement this towards the sport. Now, if you have a coach who runs their guys in practice a lot more, I think this would be a good example in this case. So for basketball, a lot of coaches in high school will do work that's just like random. They just, okay, we're gonna do, we would call them, I didn't play basketball, but the basketball team would call them Oklahoma. So they would run to the foul line back, half court back, foul line back, end point back. And it's like, what's the point of that? What are you trying to get out of that? And I think if you can challenge the sport coach, if we have that setting, if we're in a collegiate setting and we can do that, I think that you should challenge them on like, why are you doing that? Like, what are you trying to get out of them? Is it like a suffer together thing, or is it like, are we trying to increase change of direction? Because by the end of that, their change of direction is terrible. So I think in that case, like I would, in that specific case, if I have a coach that's constantly running guys, I would be aware of that, and then I would back off the endurance percentage. But in most cases, and I think most sport coaches now are getting pretty freaking good. Even football coaches are getting pretty progressive with their thought process. This is mainly what is going to be just supplemental. Okay, so we'll get through, I want to get into Sport Depth 5, which is going to be like the great distance stuff. This is going to be marathoners, and this is where everything sort of flips, okay? Because literally their sports are endurance, okay? So everything that they're doing is endurance-based. And one of the downfalls that I think that we see in the strength world is that we lose, in strength and conditioning, we don't have endurance athletes that really stay in strength and conditioning, okay? If you have a marathoner who's a good marathoner, they go and they coach marathon, okay? If you have really good 800-meter runners, they go and they coach 800-meter runners. They don't usually get into strength and conditioning. And I think that's one I wish more of those guys would get into the strength world because I think that's where we could sort of cross over and learn a lot from them, and they could also learn a lot from us. And I wanted to bring up here is like, I actually was talking to somebody earlier today about this case, is Paula Radcliffe, who was a world-class distance runner, okay, world champion, Olympic champion. She actually was doing studies on herself, and she found that when she would get her VO2 max up around like 70, okay, and she's published, there's published evidence of this from herself in the early 2000s. When she would get her VO2 max around 70, she wouldn't notice any difference if she got her VO2 max to 75, okay? But what she did notice is that when she started to lift weights and she started to squat more and she started to jump more, she would run faster over specific time frames, over specific distances, okay? But she wasn't changing her volume, she was only changing her strength work and her plyometric work. Now, the problem is that strength coaches like myself will be like, oh, you gotta stop running so much, we gotta do more jumps, and we gotta do more lifting, which can then lead to have a negative impact on them. So the whole goal with this group of athletes is literally to keep them healthy, to improve their strength in some measurements, and to improve their mobility. They tend to be really stiff individuals. So that's really what we're trying to do to keep them as healthy as possible. And we can then use these lifts, like a vertical jump, a broad jump, a single leg squat to improve their mobility, 40-yard dash. I would actually do speed work at least once a week with these athletes, okay? At least once a week they should be doing actual speed work, like sprints. And then obviously you're gonna have, okay, what's their 1 mile run, what's their 5K run? In this case, I think I think what we're seeing in the endurance realm is we're really starting to see a lot of the cutting edge science and the cutting edge sports performance work is really coming out of this specific group of athletes. Like what's FTP? you know, how can we improve like their lactate threshold? How can we improve their VO2 max? And this is where a lot of stuff is really getting cool in the realm of endurance. So the main thing here, the main takeaway is really just focusing on their overall stability as an athlete so that they are able to handle the tons of miles that they might be getting, the tons of volume that they're getting on a regular basis. Does anybody have any questions about this one? Because I want to get into some specific actual workouts then. Yeah.
When you do your training, maybe like 75% power max, does it matter we choose different from exercise like running, bike, maybe different?
75, did you say 75%?
All 75% power rate.
For somebody who would be in this one?
Yeah, or maybe like any kind of exercise.
So in this group, so are you saying like, would it matter if I have an endurance cyclist, should they be on the bike 75% of the time? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I mean, same heart rate, but different.
Oh, same heart rate. Okay. So if they're having, okay. Actually, one of the girls who's a cross-country runner from Florida that just made the team this year, she was getting banged up and injured really frequently, and she actually started to do a lot of her work on assault bikes and a lot of her work, because she had multiple stress fractures, on this new treadmill. I forget it's like a zero gravity treadmill. And then she's running like 20 to 25 miles, and the whole endurance world's like getting blown away by the fact that she's not running that much volume. So I think, to a point, I think that's reasonable that you can shift to other modalities if the heart rate is elevated to the same spot. For me personally, I don't know if I would risk that though. I would just be like, I don't know if I could deal with that. Because I get FOMO a lot, and I would be nervous that we would be switching off of, you know, if we have an endurance cyclist and they're only going in the pool all the time, there is some technical aspects around riding on the bike, right? So it's like, that's where I would be concerned. Okay, I don't have much time because I want to get into some specifics here. We use for sarcoplasmic work here, okay, we use a ton of drop sets, meaning we might work up to a 5-rep max on a back squat and then drop off and do like a set of 10 for sarcoplasmic work, okay? We might use big sets, which would be like continuous drop sets. We use mechanical drop sets, which would be like a front squat leading into, let's say a sled pull backwards leading into a leg extension, something like that. Okay, and we also do a lot of isolation burnouts, and we would do consistently isolation burnouts and drop sets almost all of the time. Okay, so those are the examples there, and this would be what a specific workout would look like, and this would be an example of where we're ramping up. You know, let's say we do a set of 7 for 100 kilos, a set of 5 on the bench press for 110, a set of 3 for 115, a set of 3 at 120, and then we do a drop set of 9. Okay, and that might even be with like a slow eccentric. And then you can see here, the bottom, this is going to be some more isometric or isolation work here. Okay, so this would be like how we would set up. Same here with the front squat, that drop set of 7. I would probably actually do 2 sets of drop sets, 2 sets of 7, and then this would be the isolation burnouts here. This would be something we consistently do in the fall for track athletes. Now, this is where I wanted to get into, because I think this is like specific endurance training stuff. Low intensity interval work. Oh, man, we skipped they don't have the updated thing I had sent in, which had the slow distance in there. This would have here, okay, actually it might be on this page. Okay, it is in there. Okay, so this is using 10 to 15 minutes. A lot of coaches will say, well, I only have so much time. If you only have 10 to 15 minutes with an athlete, do Tabata protocols. Who in here knows what a Tabata protocol is? So most of us do. Okay, so it's going to be 4 minutes. You do 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off, 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off. Do that for 4 minutes. Rest 2 minutes, repeat that. You can do that on a assault bike, you can do it on a rower, you can do it with a kettlebell swing, anything like that. If you have a specific sport that needs interval training and they don't have that much time, use them. Okay, 3 by 5 minutes, 70 plus RPMs on an assault bike. That's another protocol that's super easy to implement. Give them 2 minutes of recovery and get them done. Okay, so that would be done in about 17 minutes, or what, I guess 19 minutes. And then a moderate to light load Metcon. So that would be where we use like a sled, kettlebell swings, anything along those lines. The high intensity work, and I would not go much more past 30 minutes. Okay, so this is where we have on the minute technical coordination lifts, like that's gonna be some O lifts, that's gonna help with interval training. A Ronstadt protocol. So a Ronstadt protocol, I think this dude's name is, if I remember, Ben Ronstadt. He's got a lot of really, really cool studies, along with Steven Seiler. This is 30 seconds on, as hard as you can go, 15 seconds off. Do that 13 times, so it's gonna take you about 9.5 minutes. Okay, so you do that 13 times, and then you're gonna rest for 2.5 minutes, and then you're gonna do that again. And then you're gonna go through that, you're gonna rest for 2.5 minutes, and you're gonna do that again. It's really, really hard, but if you wanna cheat your VO2 max and increase your VO2 max really quickly, that's like the exact protocol to use, okay? There's actually, there's like 3 or 4 studies on this specific example protocol. And for wrestlers, this is probably the absolute best as well. And I would even argue, if you have O linemen or defensive linemen, a quick fix is getting them in to do this like 1 or 2 sets. Okay, so tempo runs, that would be where I'd be a little bit more leery, but just being aware that some people might get banged up from tempo runs, but even saying, okay, let's go 8 by 800 meters, and you try and get that done in 3 to 3.5 minutes, and then you have 2 minutes recovery. Okay, I believe that in this case, most of this 3-to-1 work to rest ratios or 2-to-1 work to rest ratios are gonna be best for that. Does anybody have any questions on that? On some of these? Also, this guy, Emil Zatopek, look him up. He's the greatest distance runner in the history of the sport. It's not Steve Prefontaine. This dude won the marathon in 1956, I believe. He won the marathon, the 10K, and the 5K, and he was known for doing 60 by 400 meter sprints. Okay, he was an absolute psycho apparently, but really, really good endurance. We get into now some more endurance training protocols. This is gonna be like the easy stuff. This is stuff I think that you could convince guys to do, kids to do, women to do when they're watching TV, when they're sitting on TikTok, when they're scroll braining, whatever it is that they're scroll braining on, watching YouTube videos on Garage Strength, they could be doing some type of LSD work. Easy 30 minutes on an assault bike. Okay, easy 30 minutes on a rower. 45 minutes walk. And this LSD stuff, okay, so if we're looking at easy stuff, we want to hold for both of these a talking pace. Okay, so anything that we're doing for a long period of time that we're able to talk and communicate back and forth without sounding super gassed. And this is going to be when you're doing your lactate testing, this is going to be around like 2 millimoles or below if you have any interest or have used a lactate monitor, a lactate meter. Okay, does anybody have any questions on specifics here? And I would try some of these like literally Friday or Sunday. Like literally try the Ronstadt protocol, 40 or 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off for 13 sets. Try that and do that consistently at least once a week. And couple that with some of this stuff and you will be able to implement that with your athletes almost immediately. Okay, my time is up and if you guys have any questions, I'll stick around and I'm also gonna be oh, this is our endurance week. Oh, shoot. This is all backwards. Okay, so this is actually a week layout. This is our week layout currently with South Dakota State, how we have a week here. So we'll have options, okay, for the team up here that they have to do, and everybody has to record everything, and then this is stuff that they can do on their own, okay? And so we test stuff like this in the beginning, and then we record it again here, and then we can see if they actually did the work here. Okay, so those are also some more examples of how we implement the training, and then we factor that into what their endurance. Again, it goes back to we factor in their specific endurance relative to what they do with their strength, what they do with their speed, and what they do with their explosive work. I'll leave this up. I'm going to be I have a table at our peak strength table tomorrow, and I'm going to be around. I'll stick around here as well if anybody has any questions. Yeah.
I do have a question from the live stream.
Yeah.
So Coach Smith's asking, what would be the best sort of endurance session for baseball and softball pitcher?
Ooh, that's a really, really good one. So a max velocity sport in that case, I would say an easy cyclical. I would go back on I know I'm beating a dead horse with this, but like assault bike or rower or even the Concept 2 bike. I think that in a pitcher, especially if they can do long work, okay, like 60 to 90 minutes on those on one of those tools, and then they're developing their power output, their impulse with their squats and their plyometric work, but they have the endurance to sustain that strength late in the game. Like that's, especially for a softball player, like that's going to be huge for them. And then I would do a lot of specific volume around the shoulder for a pitcher, around the trunk for a softball pitcher. But yeah, a lot of hypertrophy work as well, but mainly more volume of time because they're going to be doing so much strength work to increase their power output. And yeah. Does anybody else have any questions? Thanks for listening to me talk about endurance, and if you have questions, I'll stick around as well. Peace.